Hello there, this is ETV Special Edition and I'm Santayo Tamrat with this edition. With this edition, my point of discussion is Pan-Africanism, Agenda 2063 and related issues. And my guest today is Dr. Desta Ishimewet Mego, who is active and strong Pan-Africanist, who started the movement of Pan-Africanist in 1980s, which is over 40 years now. She has resided in Ethiopia since 2005, where she served as managing director for the Bob Marley Foundation. She is currently co-curating the Addis Ababa University Institute of Ethiopian Studies Pan-Africa Wing Permanent Exhibition, which is found at Sidiskilo University. Thank you so much for joining me. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Desta Ishimewet Mego, to ETV Special Edition.
Thank you again for having me on your show. And this is an important opportunity, as always, to share about Pan-Africanism.
What is Pan-Africanism for you as a black woman?
For me, it's an ideology, but it's also an identity. Being born in Jamaica, educated in the United States, and living and working in Africa for decades, and specifically in Ethiopia for 17 years, it is about recognizing that Africa, again, is not a country. It's a wide continent with a wide diaspora and an important culture and heritage and potential that was interrupted through colonialism. So Pan-Africanism is a way forward, but the first thing is for us to identify as Africans, hence the identity component. The ideology is what gives us the roadmap towards the development of the arrested Africa that happened through virtue of the transatlantic slave trade and all forms of colonialism and current state neocolonialism. So it is a way to address and advance the cause of the continent of Africa.
You were in this Pan-Africanism movement and other movement is related to the black people worldwide. So if you started it since 1980s, then would you share with us some of your observation on the efforts by the African Union, the African leaders and politicians towards achieving the ideals of Pan-Africanism, the ideology of forming supra-state, a united and strong Africa, as well as developing or just putting in place an authentic economic development?
It's a very good question, and I think we have to unpack it in phases, understanding that the establishment of the OAU, Organization of African Union, as you refer to our forefathers, the founding fathers, such as Emperor Haile Selassie, Kwame Nkrumah, Julius Nyerere, etc. The main purpose at that time during the 1960s was decolonization. Certainly there was the push for harmonization, and we know about the Casablanca group and the differences in terms of the approach towards the long term, but the first thing was decolonization. We have achieved that on paper, technically to speak. However, with the formation of the OAU, which is still, with the AU is still quite young. We're talking about, barely 20 years. And so their mandate is indeed the harmonization, economic development, security, and all these other issues, which has yet to really be attained. We still have roadmaps, we still have plans, we still have a lot of lofty aspirations. But are we achieving those? I dare say no, but we're on the path. And I think it's very important. In Jamaica, there's this old saying, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. So we still have the OAU, which is a solid organization set on a strong foundation by, again, prominent forefathers. So the question is, where do we go from here? And can we stand up and walk in these shoes as our predecessors have already laid the foundation? Foundation is everything. We can assemble or attempt to assemble this supra-state, as you call it, but if the elements that we're putting into this recipe for success are not strong, independent, and understand their role within the context of a supra-state, then it is going to be a very difficult road. We as Pan-Africanists know with all our heart and soul that eventually we will have a united continent. It's just a matter of time. You understand? But the reality is that right now, we still have Africans who are proud when they speak in French rather than in Wolof, which is the language of Senegal. You know, we have debates on whether it's UN floor or African Union floor when it comes to interpretation. We don't have interpretations for Amharic, Oromo, Tree, Zulu, you know, these other languages. Yes, Swahili is there. So I think if we begin to understand the power of our culture, our heritage, as part of the building blocks of even the economy, because all these things are just not numbers. You see, we're not like Westerners. Everything that Africans do and are about reflect back on our society, our community, our family, our culture. And so that has to be integrated in anything that we're doing. Otherwise, we're mimicking the EU. And we're mimicking Western principles and platforms and plans that are not relevant to us. Yes, we can borrow best practices, but if we keep trying to mimic the West, then we will continuously be like hamsters on this, you know, cycle, trying to be like them. So once we see our value and give our value to each state, we've got 55 states, we have to recognize each and every one for what assets that they bring as building blocks to a superstructure.
Then if you have just to mention the challenges the African Union or the continent is grappling with, particularly in terms of achieving these two goals, the united and strong Africa, as well as economic emancipation or economic prosperity. What problems or challenges do you mention?
Well, again, it goes back to my latter comment in that we are not looking at the value that we have. Everything that is in the West, for the most part, that is good, prosperous, and economically viable, has a string that leads you back to Africa. Whether it's our raw natural resources, whether it's the human power, whatever it may be, it's all here. Even, let's take, for instance, medical care, right? We don't think we have the best medical care, so we fly out to Europe or to America. Who are the attending physicians in these hospitals? They're Nigerians, they're Ethiopians, they're Ghanaians, they're Jamaicans, you know? They're not just Europeans. So it's the knowledge that we have to begin to develop and hone, and it takes time. We may even want to take a page out of the book from India. Remember when India got its independence from Britain? One of the things that the British had to say is, well, how are you going to survive now? What's going to happen? Because we've built the roads, we've put the infrastructure in, and basically the response was, we'll figure it out. It may take us time, but this is part of the sovereign right. Let us go through our bumps and bruises and our stumbling blocks, but it'll be on our terms. Africa has to have the courage to say that at some point and understand that the 1.4 billion people on the continent will support these leaders. But until we take, you see, there's another old saying, you can't serve two masters. You cannot serve two masters. You either serve in God or the devil, right? In that sense, in a spiritual sense. But if you're going to have relationships with Europe and other partners, it must be on Africa's terms. And there's nothing wrong with that because they want to be here. They need us. Matter of fact, much more than we need them.
Well, what should the African Union and leaders here in Africa, politicians, as well as the black community across the globe do in order for the African people and black people across the world to see a strong Africa, a united Africa, and also a more peaceful, prosperous Africa?
You know, that question has both a symbolic and a substantive answer. And symbolism is also very good. Why I say that is the answer to this question for me has always, again, had culture at its basis. The first 1963 OAU summit, when 32 heads of states gathered here Emperor Haile Selassie established the Institute of Ethiopian Studies Museum, and that was a visiting place, a high point during the summit, to show the culture of Ethiopia, to share that with truth, because Ethiopian culture intrinsically is impacting the entire continent of Africa one way or another. So culture was used. In 1966, President Senghor, called Poet President, he also established the first African or first black festival of the arts. And artists from the black world gathered in Senegal as a form of solidarity, a form of communication, because while we may speak different languages, we understand and appreciate culture. We understand and appreciate art and music. And so if the African Union begins to embrace, particularly the African diaspora, and what we've done, just as Ghana is doing, and including that, we now have symbols, we now have songs. People still sing Bob Marley's song. I'm the managing director of the Bob Marley Foundation. I came and organized Africa Unite 17 years ago. We saw what this did. So not embracing the creative cultural industries, the artists within this journey of Pan-Africanism is a major mistake, because who wants to listen to politicians? Let's face it, okay? Unless we're critiquing them and finding fault. But we'll sing, we'll listen, we'll look at a piece of art, we'll listen to a poetry, see a theater, and those embody African culture. Now, on the substantial level, there need to be programs in place that can also feed the creative cultural industry, because it's not just about having these good messages and songs that impact and influence particularly the youth, but there's an economic base. Ernst & Young has done global mapping. It's a multi-trillion-dollar industry. So we can have the best of both worlds through the promotion of our arts and culture. We can look at so many movies, whether it was Black Panther, whatever. We saw the icons. These things do well. We have to begin to learn and appreciate the value that we have as Africans. When you go to the African Union meetings, everybody is in Armani suits. We have wonderful African designers, you know, so why don't we begin to embrace our Pan-Africanism, right? Our wide African culture, and start to promote that in a way that, again, a new generation now of young people, because we all have a shelf life, right? We all have a shelf life. So I think this is a very important and missing link. And we don't have to look too far. As I said, Ghana is doing an excellent job in terms of using culture and reaching out to the African diaspora to make sure that Ghana is relevant.
That's a nice point regarding Pan-Africanism. And now let's move on to Agenda 2063. It has been 10 years so far since it was launched. And how do you see the progress of our?
It's a very good question. In 2013, I was actually commissioned to curate an exhibition at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies that launched it. And part of the initiative was creating a time capsule. So we interviewed and got in writing maybe 30 or 40 impressions from young Ethiopians. They were between the ages of 12 and 18, and asked them, because Agenda 2063 will affect them more so than us, even if God spares us. And so here 10 years later now, we have a whole collection of these notes from young Ethiopians, basically stating what they see, what their contributions will be, and how, most importantly, they can impact 2063. So it's not looking at it from the perspective as what the government will do for you, but what you can do for your government, what you can do for Africa. So within that regards, we do have young people who are thinking. The question is, what will our leaders do? What are we entrusting? I think African leaders in regard to 2063 and accomplishing some of these things, which I certainly think we can check the box on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That has been a massive, massive initiative. Although we have not yet reached full implementation, I think the spirit of it to create the largest trading bloc in the world, we can't go wrong with it. But we must have the will for implementation. And again, embracing women and youth through the process and not just keeping this as sort of a paper tiger and a policy, but a true implementation of something that our forefathers saw. This is reintegration through economics, right? And the free trade agreement also allows for the movement of people and services, not just goods. So relaxation of visas. So we're seeing some movement in some of the countries towards this regard. Do we want more? Yes. Do we want to wait for another 40 years? No. So it's our hope that within the next 10 years we can really see serious movement.
Then African politicians argued that Africa's development endeavor has been partly hampered by Western imperialism, unilateralism, and intervention in political affairs of Africa. Not political affairs only, but economic affairs of Africa. So what's your take on that and the ways out as well?
Well, that was always the plan. Capitalism and colonialism from the Western standpoint is one, and that's how they've been able to build their empires. So that was always the blueprint. That was always the plan. The question is, what is our plan? What is our plan? And how long do we want to be beholden to their plan and their agendas? Again, going back to our value, our power, our courage and confidence. Our forefathers had so much courage. Can you imagine in the 1960s to be able to say we're cutting their ties, even if, again, a lot of it was symbolic on paper, because many currencies, as you know, such as in Western Africa, still have to go back to the Bank of France or Bank of England, whatever, part of Commonwealth. So the question is, when does Africa and our African leaders, when will they be ready to cut the ties of imperialism and unilateralism? Because we're no longer slaves. It's time to emancipate, right? As Marcus Garvey said, and Bob Marley made it into a song, emancipate your mind, right, from mental slavery. This is what we're grappling with now more than everything. Because if we're not confident in our culture, our history, our heritage, and our future, again, we're going to continue in this cycle of being an afterthought and basically being strung along by the puppeteer or the invisible hand of imperialism and capitalism.
When we say just some percentage of the continent is, most countries' budget, annual budget, is through donations, loans, grants, and so on. And we can also see the African Union itself. Significant portion of its budget, annual budget, is from Westerners. So when we see this, it's not just possible even to see the fruits of Pan-Africanism, whatever Africanists struggle for that. Then what is just your suggestion for this?
Well, one thing I've learned living in Ethiopia the last 17 years is patience. Colonialism, and again, I have to go back to my history being taken from West Africa and my ancestors taken to the island of Jamaica through the transatlantic slave trade. We're trying to correct hundreds of years in 20 years. It's just not possible. And I think we should be hopeful and proud of whatever measures we make towards it. It was Nelson Mandela that says the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. So let us continue to take one step, one step. Yes, we need speed. Yes, we need haste. But most of all, we need movement. So if that movement is going to be a slow path, and that's what we have, we'll take it. We're not going to like it or love it, and we'll do our best in terms of the people, the citizenry, to push things along. But we cannot change hundreds of years of colonization and a colonized mentality where we as Africans don't even know and appreciate ourselves. You understand? We cannot change that in 10 years or even 50 years. So this is going to take time. And as we celebrate the 60th anniversary of the formation of the OAU, there are initiatives. For instance, Ethiopia now has its first Pan-African Wing, which is a permanent exhibition at the Institute of Ethiopian Studies Museum. So within all levels, because it's not just government's responsibility, it's the people. We all have to do our part. private sector, citizenry, the youth, and this is where it's going to come. But if we ever stop or continue to believe that answers just come from government alone, it's the wrong way for us to change.
What do you say here about just the corruption, fighting against corruption, and also cultivating indigenous knowledge, promoting those indigenous knowledge as well as democratical practices, indigenous democratical practices? I think this can be the ways out, and what is your reaction to that?
Absolutely. I remember some years ago when we were looking at the African Union, looking at our own court system in lieu of ICC, and one of the discussions I had with then one of the candidates was, are we going to integrate indigenous and traditional knowledge systems into our governance? You know, here we have the Shamagle. You know, so this is critical because, again, if we're going to adopt Western canons, and as a jurist, I can tell you, everything is based on common law or civil law out of UK or France. This is critical. Every aspect, whether economic, political, cultural, social, we must embrace indigenous knowledge, best practices, because this is how we've survived all these thousands of years. So now do we shelve this for what is called the experiment? It's called democracy. It's an experiment.
How do you explain the role of Ethiopia for the foundation of the Organization of the African Union and for decolonizing some African countries and also for being the voice of Africa and African concerns in the international arena?
And again, as I mentioned before, the Pan-African wing at Addis Ababa University Institute of Ethiopian Studies actually has an entire exhibition which I co-curated that speaks just to this. From the time of Adwa until right now, the No More movement, Ethiopia has always been at the forefront. Whether we placed ourselves there or we were put there by Africans looking and seeking, you know, this beacon of hope and beacon of light, it has been Ethiopia, and it continues to be Ethiopia. The question is, how do we balance our role as a proud nation within the context of the continent? Because we cannot separate ourselves from the continent in terms of how we're going to develop, the impact that we're going to have. You can drive around any African country, you're going to find the Lion of Judah flag. You're going to find red, gold, and green. It's there. It's identified with Ethiopia. Ethiopia still is a beacon of hope. Regardless of what we're going through, the black world looks towards Ethiopia. So part of the challenge that we have now is, again, embracing the wider African diaspora. We've done a very good job embracing the Ethiopian diaspora. Wonderful job. But there's an entire black world out there, including even the continent of Africa, that is ready to be embraced by Ethiopia. So in regard to us fulfilling our divine role, because this has happened for centuries, right? That Ethiopia has been that stalwart, has been the vanguard of sovereignty and Ethiopian African pride. We must begin to embrace and look, especially as the diplomatic capital of Africa. And if we don't do that sooner than later, because it's happening, again, the road is going to be a very long and tedious one, but we shall get there.
So you have been actively engaged in African movement, is Black people movement, is Pan-Africanism, and you have been just voicing the concerns of Black people, starting from the United States of America to Africa and here in Ethiopia. It has been just over 40 years, I guess.
Yes, because I'm now 61, yeah.
So you have been just closely following the African agendas here at the AU, and if you have just given the chance to bring an agenda which is most important for alleviating African issues for this 36th summit, what sort of agenda will you bring?
Well, you know, as the former liaison to the African Union for the Diaspora Africa Forum, we have an MOU, and we're the only diaspora organization that had an MOU that was penned. And part of it, again, looked at emphasizing the role of women and youth and, again, traditional leaders. We feel that these three areas are very, very important within advancing what it is, whether it's Agenda 2063 or just even our everyday work at the African Union, sensitizing this institution to what is in our hand. You know, many times we have gold and we want to treat it like it is just nothing. So I think it's very important for us to go back again to culture, and I cannot underestimate the role and power of the arts. You can have a Bob Marley song that fuels a movement, right? A movement of people in liberation areas or whatever. Get up, stand up, wake up and live. You know, the arts are just critically important. So if the African Union can revisit where we were under the leadership of people like Chairman Konare and Chairperson Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, that did include the diaspora and did include the culture and the arts as a major part of development, I think the AU would begin to get itself back on track.
Dr. Desta Mego, a strong, active Pan-Africanist, I really appreciate the explanations you have given to us on Pan-Africanism and Agenda 2063 and related issues. I really appreciate that. Thank you so much for joining ETV Special Edition.
Thank you so much for having me.
Dear viewers, this has been the conversation with Dr. Desta Mego, who is active Pan-Africanist and that has served this movement and ideology for the past 40 years or more. Thank you so much for joining me and Absentayo Tamrat with this special edition. See you another time.